Hello, in this video, I want to continue the conversation I started in the last video talking a little bit about Fred Moten and Stefano's arguments in relationship to the worker strike resolution that's coming up for Lincoln Douglas for the next couple months. I definitely think that Fred Moten and Stefano Harney are a really interesting set of authors to talk about in relationship to the worker strike because I feel like they have so much stuff written about the way in which we relate to movement building at a social level and what it means in terms of our relationship to politics and governance. And I think a lot of the arguments that they're making about the way in which governance kind of like works passively and through the way in which we kind of perform social acts is really important to how we think about the worker strike as a resolution, because I feel like a lot of the things that they kind of bring to bear are about the way in which that kind of like socialization under the worker strike, when put in relationship to the state, is one that becomes really hazardous to like what like the worker strike is attempting to accomplish, and its ability to kind of attend to like the legacies of violence that have created the moment that necessitates the worker strike. And so I think that in this video, I kind of want to continue on from the intro and talk a little bit about what I think Moten and Harney's arguments will look like on the negative versus policy teams on this resolution. I actually think that on this resolution, Moten and Harney's arguments are really good negative arguments to make because I think that the kind of like top level critiques of just like humanism and kind of like human recognition and governmentality and governance and the kind of like state recognition portions of the resolution are all kind of like really necessary to every affirmative. And I feel like there are so many good arguments that Moten and Harney have to make offensively against these types of things that I think are really useful as kind of like tool sets to really answer policy arguments. And so in this video, I want to talk a little bit about just like some of the priorities that I think and that you should have when trying to read this argument versus a policy affirmative on the resolution, and then thinking about what some of the like framing and thesis concerns are that kind of set you up for like more specific portions of the debate. I think that when I'm thinking about just some of the core priorities that you really need to be thinking of when you're trying to make an argument like this or execute it, I think that the first thing is being able to kind of like think about how you want to consider your description of the relationship between revolution and resistance and the sovereign. I feel like often I've kind of like used a lot of the Moten videos, if you've seen some of them, to really talk about the idea of like policy and planning and the relationship that they have to each other. And I think that even at like just a top level, this is a really good way to kind of like separate and explain the intentions between the affirmatives kind of like move of recognition of the workers' strike and the alternatives kind of like act of resistance and the way in which it relates to a differential kind of like set of actions and tactics. And I think that the way that you kind of like execute something like this is by spending a lot of like your framing and thesis really kind of connecting the two to this central idea of like the way in which the state attempts to like operationalize or consume movements that are kind of created in order to correct the state or to resist against the state and make it kind of like, or to destitute it and make it so that that planners can continue to believe in policy, that policy can give planners hope to be able to continue to act socially and politically in such a way that allows them to be seen and read as kind of like legible, like law-abiding citizens. And I feel like there are so many good arguments that Moten and Harney can then kind of like stretch on to make outside of that are about why the kind of conditions that kind of like make us believe what is kind of this like law-abiding like citizen are really measures to kind of like uphold a system of recognition that privileges like passive forms of resistance that don't actually challenge the fundamental concerns that create the kind of like violence of governance itself. And I think that being able to center a lot of the arguments that you kind of like hold dear through this kind of like framing is essentially important for how you're able to kind of like make the rest of your offense pop when you want to make more specific links to the affirmative, which I think is really possible with the kind of like general framework that we're setting up at the top. I think that when you're kind of like thinking about what this looks like in just the framing debate more specifically, I think that it's really important that not only that you're making arguments about policy and planning, but that you make an argument about how the judge's decision is kind of related to that process, that like policy and planning is done by the way in which we evaluate what types of tactics are reliable and good, the way in which we are basically use, things like falsifiability and feasibility as ways to talk about the viability of certain movements to become like possible and to like enact resistance, the ways in which we kind of like think about like what type of evidence and scholarship should be privileged are all are ways in which we kind of invest in this system of policy that basically makes it impossible for us to think about like what it is protecting against and what that kind of like outside looks like in relationship to how we form resistance. And I feel like this is the place where you can make arguments about how like interesting arguments about like how side bias swings in ways that are like referred to as policy, and the way in which they're able to like create the F as in something that should be evaluated in the back or in a vacuum makes it harder for us to kind of like dissuade or get rid of the biases that like hold us to continue to give hope into policy, right? Or to make arguments about like the way in which kind of like planning opens up these like radically different ways of thinking about what is possible and what types of connections can be made. And I think that aligning that with like a lot of historical examples of various types of ways that like planning is taken as like tactics that are passed through generations, don't need to be done through like academic or formal content, and are done in such a way that like are able to like code and create of kind of like pamphlets for what resistance looks like moving forward. And I think being able to do stuff like that is like extremely important in being able to make a strong argument on this resolution, especially at the top level of how you're kind of like separating the differences between the movements that the affirmative is endorsing and what you'll kind of be endorsing later on, whether you're going for like a refusal alternative or if you're going for one that's really based in contesting the types of movements that are possible. I think then when you kind of like move this into like a thesis consideration, I think it's really important to like consider like what types of thesis questions can you take from this that now expand the question policy and planning to now just being like not just a set of roles between the affirmative and the negative, but being a way to really describe the act and how like the kind of like the way in which the sovereign is kind of like made, or governmentality or the government is made in such a way to create and forward policy that kind of like reactively subsumes various types of forms of resistance. I think that there are so many really good examples of the state co-opting programs that are created by radical resistance movements and mutual aid programs, but also working to like crush those movements at the same time and being able to create this kind of relationship of continuing to like necessitate the life conditions of those that they marginalize, those that they marginalize both, while also continuing to pursue active violence and various forms of like structural erasure. And I think making arguments about how this kind of creates this kind of like basically leverage and usage of things like worker strike to be the next form of consumption is a really good place to kind of start off your kind of like base core criticism of why this kind of like process of recognition by the state is actively worse than the status quo, which is kind of as the negative, I feel like always the question that you really want to be holding on to at the end of the debate. And I think that really kind of contesting it from like the place that it's just like, even if recognition seems like it has these like contingent material gains, it is done so in the face to like create and pursue violence that is like often like weaponized against those that are seen as more radical, or those that are kind of like erased from the archives, in order for us to continue to promote like primary narratives about basically what is like happening in the nation's history and erase these kind of like resistance movements from them. And that this further like expansion and subsumption of movements only serves to create and inform further forms of insidious violence that happen like on the purview of those movements that like aren't recognized as passive or like non-violent enough, etc., etc. Hopefully this video was helpful, and hopefully it's good setup for you going into the next video where we'll talk a little bit more about the questions of like what we should be doing against policy teams on negative with a strategy like this. And yeah, thanks.